Welcome everyone to the Thursday lunchtime lecture. My name's Peter Jones, and it's a great pleasure to act as chair for our colleague Emilio Fernandez-Egea's talk. Emilio is well known to us all, lead academic consultant for the new Cambridge Psychosis Centre. He is very active in schizophrenia research, particularly around negative symptoms, which is your topic for the day, Emilio. And you've recently taken on being an advisor to the Wellcome Trust for their psychosis funding program. So that's a great accolade. Congratulations on that. So let's hand over to you, Emilio, for new paradigms for the negative symptoms.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you attending today's talk, and thank you, Peter, for the kind introduction. I'm going to present a bit the work that we have been developing over the last few years on negative symptoms and what are the next steps and what are we planning to endure for the next few years. But let me set from the beginning a set of goals. What is the talk about? A is whether to define whether we should be continuing using the term negative symptoms and whether that's useful or not. B is how can we measure the negative symptom, or what we have been calling as negative symptoms. And C will be the pathophysiology and how can we understand the concept of negative symptoms as a transdiagnostic perspective and not that much focus on schizophrenia. Definition, we know what negative symptoms is, everybody has been aware of. Is this the yin and yang with the positive symptoms, the opposite, something that is a lessening or an absence of a normal function? And more recently, we has been agreed there are 5 different negative symptoms: the blunted affect, which is these restricted emotions, the alogia, the paucity of speech or reduction in the number of words that we use, and the asociality, the lack of interest in social interactions, the anedonia, the lack of sense of pleasure, and the abolition, the lack of engagement in activities, mostly on work and self-care. So these are the definition of the 5 agreed negative symptoms and what we have been using. Well, what is the interest, perhaps? Well, the interest is that since the inception of the DSM-3, negative symptoms as such, just without much specificity, has been considered as a core symptom of schizophrenia, as you know. Something that perhaps people don't need to have as this criteria for being diagnosed with schizophrenia, but has been always one of the 5 core symptoms of the DSM. And as you can see on the bottom, whereas the interest on negative symptoms has been always smaller than on positive symptoms, there's a gradual increase over the last 5-10 years on trying to understand what negative symptoms are and how can we address them. One of the things, preparing a bit this talk, honestly, I spent a bit of time trying to understand where this concept coming from. Where is the term negative symptoms coming from? Because we all think about this idea of the Jacksonian approach, and that's something positive and new, but actually that's a relatively novel idea, using the term negative symptoms. And tracing this back mysteriously comes from what I've now disgraced psychiatrist, the head of the USSR psychiatric unit in Sedation in '68, who was the very first one who coined the term negative symptoms. And actually, he was that caused some interest in many people and spread around. Sedation is possibly someone who is not well remembered in part, or is perhaps more remembered because in the 20 years later, he was expelled from the honorary fellowship from the Royal College because of his links or leading into the use of psychiatry against the political dissidents in USSR. So it has a very strange origin, this term. The truth is that a few years later, in the 70s, Carpenter and company adopted this idea of the negative symptoms and then spread around the world like Halloween. Everybody agreed with this American view of the negative symptoms. We had some difficulties on measuring this concept of negative symptoms for a number of years. Initially, we were using the BPRS, but as you can see, they only contain emotional symptoms. And from the 80s, there has been the creation of new scales. the SANS, for instance, with these five symptoms, but really 4 that we now consider negative symptoms, or the PANS, and especially the negative syndrome superscale that contains a mix of what we now consider negative symptoms and cognitive symptoms. Indeed, there has been like an explosion of different scales that we have been using for measuring negative symptoms. And as you can see there, nothing has been really comprehensive or really something that captures all the negative symptoms that we have been using. Back in 2006, the National Institute of Mental Health in the States gathered together all the researchers in the States about negative symptoms, aiming to agree what will be the measures. How can we find a new statement or a new scale to measure negative symptoms? And they came up with 2 of them. I'm more familiar with anhedonia, with the BNSS, and this is the scale that contains the 5 symptoms plus an additional one called distress, and most of the symptoms contain some superscales aiming to rate either the behavior or the internal experience. Something like asociality, whether someone is meeting up with people, yes or no, and whether it's not meeting up with people just because they are not interested or because they have no their possibilities to meet up with them. This scale is complex. It's not an easy scale to use. It contains too many factors. It contains the factor of distress that actually, when you put the total score, should be removed from the total score. So it's not an easy scale to understand. Factor analysis, what have done with this scale is showing that there are 2 main factor analyses or factors that can summarize the scale. One is the motivation and pleasure, that includes anhedonia, asociality, and abolition. Another, the emotional expressivity, which is the blunted affect and the alogia. So trying to tear up these 2 main factors that contains this scale, or that you can divide the negative symptoms in. That's when I started mostly working on or return on the interest of negative symptoms. I participated or led the study on the validation into Spanish with another 3 teams. And we found that using some videos that we all watch, the inter-rater and the test-retest assessment was very high, and we were happy to produce this scale in Spanish language. We started to do more analysis, and we started to argue with the authors that that perhaps rather than 2 components, there might be 3 components, and we can divide the scale in a different approach, so in different ways. Rather than entering the classical argue and contra-argue, what we end up doing is putting all the information together, working with the people in States, but also with the Italy, with the Switzerland, and with China, and using 1,700 cases that were assessed with the BNSS, we found that actually the best model, the best way to use to split the scale was using this two order with 5 factors, meaning the 5 symptoms are independent to each other, but they can be clustered together in these 2 factors: the anhedonia, motivation, and asociality, the motivation and pleasure factor, and the blunted affect and alogia, which is the expression. That sounds very novel or very interesting, and actually we have managed to last week to confirm that using this distinction between the 5 factors, the 5 symptoms, and the 2 factors, you can understand better other symptoms that we find in schizophrenia, like symptoms of cognition, function symptom, or other symptoms like psychosis. So these are another 600 cases, new sample compared to the previous one, but again measuring the same factors. The idea that these are 2 different factors, which is pretty cool. It's pretty cool that in 2021 we found that there are 2 factors, but that was the second sentence in the first page of Kraepelin book. That was described from day one, that we perhaps should not be, there is something about the emotional life and the volitional life. And that was since seriously, is the second sentence. I've tried to look in the book, trying to find work, aiming to spend days trying to find this in the book. Is the second sentence. There are two different domains. And that's relevant. And I think it's relevant because I'm not fully sure how relevant or how useful are the term negative symptoms. It's something that is not recovery friendly. It's quite stigmatizing. People don't like to hear that they have negative symptoms. People don't use, not even the clinicians, because they don't help that much, why we should be using that. It has a very weak and dubious historical roots, and I've been telling you about how that comes from the USSR. The psychometrics shows that there are two factors. There is the motivation and emotion. So that's actually has been there for more than 100 years. And probably that represents two different biological mechanisms. Therefore, personally, I'm not using anymore or try to remove as much as I can the term negative symptoms from all my clinical letters and from research, of course. I'm trying to talk about motivation or other parts of motivation and emotional dysfunctions, or describing clearly these two spheres, because it doesn't help. And I know that people might think, well, Emilio, that's semantics. Just what's the interest on talking about semantics? It is relevant. If we don't distinguish the factors, we end up doing studies like this, where we try to improve the negative symptoms with new medications without distinguishing the two of them and using scales that probably are not measuring what you need to measure. That was a 1 billion project by Roche using vitopertin. And that not only killed the vitopertin line, it killed all the neuroscience line by Roche and many others. So it's kind of important. This nomenclature, this terminology is kind of important. Another question is, how can we measure these so-called negative symptoms? Actually, we have been using the BNSS for schizophrenia as if only people with schizophrenia suffer with negative symptoms. Actually, the symptoms itself, the anhedonia, the lack of social interest, the lack of motivation for persistent activities, is something that you see across all the so-called psychiatric disorders. Not only psychiatric disorders, also in people with apathy or with brain disorders. It's something that you can see all around all different brain disorders. So therefore, can we use something that is a bit more terminology that we can use among all of us? When I was checking this slide or this table a while ago, I was surprised that they say that 47% of the people with schizophrenia suffers with apathy, which is a core negative symptom. I cannot see apathy. Perhaps I'm a bit fixated with terminology, but what is apathy? How can we communicate with other specialties if we are not using the same terminology? We have alogia, we have anhedonia, but we don't have apathy. And that's this Babel tower that we have been building over the years, when it doesn't seem that any of the different specialties seems to be communicating to each other. There's the idea that has grown over the last decade or so about considering apathy, not only about the behavioral, but also the emotional apathy, the social apathy, and the behavioral apathy, and that perhaps that can be linked with anhedonia, asociality, and abolition. Actually, we were working with the team with Masoud Hussein and another team in Oxford. They were the first publishing this AMI, the Apathy Motivation Index, in people with neurodegenerative conditions. And we have been using that in people with schizophrenia, and actually the loads are very similar. So we probably can start to use scales that can be across the different disorders in order to improve this Babel tower. In order to improve that, one of the things I did is looking at Philippe Robert, who is a Nice consultant, professor in Nice, and who works with people with old age psychiatry. And he has developed this consensus with another 100 different psychiatrists and neurologists in Europe about how can we measure apathy as a dichotomic approach, whether someone has apathy or not, and dividing these three main components: the behavioral, the emotion, and the social interaction. And he was interested on checking what is the prevalence of apathy in people with schizophrenia using this criteria. So we have a chat a couple of years ago, I set up a network of how to use this criteria of apathy in people with schizophrenia. And we set up these 6 sites in Europe that we are doing this study, the cases study, leading with Philippe Robert, but also a lot of people that I know that are interested, particularly in negative symptoms, like Armida Mucci and Silvana Galderisi in Napoli, or Stefan Kaiser or Anna Manet in Geneva or Barcelona. I'm also interested always to do studies with the south of Europe because that's a good way to visit them later on, but that hasn't happened so far. The main aim was to study what is the prevalence, and that's what the initial idea, but we try to hide something else. We try to add on a bit more inside this study, trying to understand not only the prevalence, but also adding these 3 or 4 different ways to assess negative symptoms, using this Robert diagnostic criteria, using the PANSS, which has been the gold standard, using the BNSS, which is the gold standard right now, and the AMI, which are self-rated, and understand what will be the best scale that we can use in clinical practice in order to assess these symptoms. On top of this, we also assess and that will be part of the end of the talk, about the secondary negative symptoms, but many other assessments are done in patients at the same time that we're on this. I'm afraid that I was expecting today to show you some of the preliminary data, but despite we're starting in 2019 with the team and doing the protocol, and I think that we all are sort of experts on navigating the rocky waters and difficult waters, the COVID waves has been perhaps a bit more than the usual to manage. So we finally started the recruitment, the face-to-face, back in April. Really, it kicked on from all summer this year, and we are now halfway through on all the assessments. So we still don't have any of the results, but hopefully by the end of the year, beginning of January, we will have all achieved the 30 per group. So to finish this second part, please, we need to use something to measure negative symptoms. And among all the scales, perhaps the one dedicated to negative symptoms, the BNSS, will be my preferred right now. But making sure that we're using the 2 factors, the motivation or the apathy scale and the emotional scale. In the future, perhaps what we should be doing is using more dedicated scales like the AMI or DCA, we will see which one, but something that allows us to communicate across the different species in the research field with not only schizophrenia, but also with affective disorders or people with neurodegenerative conditions. Because the important bit there is that should we have a way to assess symptoms similarly, perhaps we can understand a bit better why it's causing the negative symptoms and what is the pathophysiology of the negative symptoms. Going back to this slide, as you can see, apathy is something that is impacted in many other disorders or many other conditions, not only in schizophrenia. So perhaps we can find what is the commonality there. I'm not going to claim I'm an expert on this field at all, but as you know, there is a different approach, a relatively novel approach about the research domain of cognition, understanding that similar symptoms should have a similar biological substrate and different components that we can perhaps understand. We have people here that has been far more experienced than me on understanding and overlapping the different parts of Graham's studies on anhedonia, and how that the same overlapping anatomical areas are activated during the anhedonia in people with schizophrenia and depression. So adding this idea that this transdiagnostic commonalities that perhaps can make us understand and target better treatments in the future. So I fall in love with this idea. I'm interested in this idea. So someone approached me, Stefano Palminteri, a good friend from France now, about the idea perhaps that exploring using this cognitive approach, whether schizophrenia, they have not a lack of lack of interest in reward, but an excess of perception of punishment. And he has a very noble and very interesting contrafactual task that was very interesting, and we put that. We conducted this study 5-6 years ago, along with George Sabulich and Gisela Mazquida from Barcelona. And I'm putting that here just because it didn't work. We mess up. We didn't make a good task. The task was too complex. People miss a lot of the information. And it's a gentle reminder to everybody that research is tough and you fail. And there are times that you put a lot of effort and you end up reaching nothing. And I know that most of the talks always are about the success and how wonderful we find things. Sometimes it's not. And that was a huge work, and we didn't get anything because probably it was not well designed. But I continue, I perseverate. And Masood Hussain, who is a professor in Oxford in neurology, came to the Department of Psychology, 4 or 5 years ago, and talking about apathy. And Paul Fletcher very kindly introduced us, and he was having this approach, this idea of deconstructing the apathy into different components. And of course, we could see easily what are the overlap between the apathy in neurodegenerative conditions and in schizophrenia. And actually, he was already working with John Reuser, who I believe came a few months ago to give a similar talk about the apathy in anhedonia, in affective disorders. So he has this interesting, for me, way of deconstructing the concept of apathy, that moving from the option generation, so the ideas that comes to your mind in order to, you will not generate, or you will not have an action unless you have an idea of what you want to do. But then there will be an evaluation of what is a good thing, or how much that would cost, and how much reward or how much pleasure will that give to me. I'm trying to understand how you will plan to make the action, and how much you enjoy, and how much you remember what you have enjoyed, how much have you learned. So this deconstruction of the apathy, I thought it was very interesting. Going back to the idea, how can we measure this apathy? How can we understand the apathy, and how can we do some tasks to understand the apathy? And with Joseph, also from Masood Hussain's team, we have just published this review about the different models, the different tasks that can be used for assessing cognitively the different components of the apathy. And we actually have also finished a study using this effort-based decision-making task. We, along with Isaac Jarrett, we recruited 40 people from the Clozapine clinic with treatment-resistant schizophrenia and 40 healthy controls. And we did this task, which is very interesting. It's the so-called the apple gathering task that Masood has been using Professor Hussain has been using in a wide range of neurological conditions. And that is a task in which people need to exert physical effort in order to decide or to gather some apples from a virtual tree. But the number of apples changes and varies from 1 to 13, and as much as also varies the level of effort, but in a random way. Sometimes you need to do a lot of effort to get 1 apple, or you need to do little effort for getting 13 apples. And you need to decide whether you want to go for it or not, or that's a bit too much effort or not interest. And that's in preparation. I think will be submitted fairly soon. So I think we can present the data. What I was particularly surprised, and we were surprised because what we saw there was a completely different, something that we were not expecting. Of course, people with schizophrenia might have a reduced reward sensitivity. So they are perhaps less interested on some reward. But mysteriously, we only found this on the higher rewards, which was a bit surprising. And it's not because that requires more effort. Effort was not the problem. The problem was, or the limitation, the ceiling there was, I will not try to get the higher reward, which it's linked to some of the theories about the negative symptoms, about the self-defeated idea. Why I should be trying the higher reward? I will never reach higher reward. I will never even try to do a higher reward. And that's an idea that sticks in my mind and trying to understand. There it is. One of the collateral analysis in the study is that perhaps some of this lack of reward sensitivity was associated with cognitive deficits, and at least in part, the link between the cognitive symptoms and the negative symptom has been always there. Actually, the idea, and that I'm taking some of the ideas, the previous ideas, that they are not one negative symptoms. They are what we call primary negative symptoms, and they are secondary negative symptoms. You can understand the lack of interest to meet up with people just as inherent or as a primary symptom of the schizophrenia, or perhaps secondary to numerous other reasons, like depression, like an antipsychotic side effect, like paranoia or hallucinations. That is what is making the apathy or the negative symptoms in schizophrenia particularly perhaps far more complex than in any other constructs. Just because of this goes a bit slow, sorry. There should be, the next one should be there. Even the apathy, this is all the conundrum of the brain chemistry that we use in schizophrenia. Dopamine is the key neurotransmitter for apathy. There is the idea that an excess of dopamine associated with psychosis, when you antagonize with antipsychotics, you pay a price as well by increasing the negative symptoms. So this balance, this conundrum in the treatment of negative symptoms, or understanding or tearing apart the different parts of the negative symptoms or the apathy in schizophrenia is a problem. We did some studies about actually the 10-15% even of the novelist scales, like the BNSS, can be explained not by negative symptoms, but by other factors, like the antipsychotic effect on the emotional expression, or the sedation, or the depression. So again, we need to start to abandon, and that's what I will be talking in the next 5 minutes, the idea that doing simple studies on schizophrenia, these are complex, and perhaps rather than running away from the simplicity and reductionist approach of comparing two scales, we perhaps need to embrace this complexity in a way. And let me explain you how I think we should be trying to embrace this complexity. This recent paper that we have published with a lot of names that perhaps you recognize here from colleagues in the CPFT, that has nothing to do. It's about sedation and how we can treat sedation in people with schizophrenia. Oh, sorry, on Clozapine. But I hide there intentionally in the supplementary results what was the major factor driving sedation in our study. Actually, was the degree of negative symptoms. Makes no sense. It's possibly the other way around. The degree of sedation is something that is affecting your negative symptoms. That's the problem at that time is that we have only one measure, the CGI for negative symptoms. For those of you perhaps are not aware, that's only one symptom or one scale, one score, and perhaps it's not the most efficient way to assess that. So with Noam and with Shankwan, we have started to do perhaps a different approach using the BNSS that is far more richer in the way to assess the negative symptoms. What we have found is that actually the level of sedation measured as the number of hours that people are sleeping per day actually impacts have a deleterious impact on the level of motivation. Not that much about the emotional expression, but in the level of motivation, the level of apathy, and that impacts the abolition, the asociality, and anhedonia significantly. So let's start to disentangle the different factors that might be associated with the negative symptom or with the different components of the negative symptoms. Going a bit beyond, we also found that with combining the two studies, that the level of Clozapine or the amount of the dose of Clozapine impacted motivation in one hand and also impacted sedation in the other hand. So perhaps we can use a nicer statistical approaches and considering how much is really Clozapine impacting motivation and how much is that through reducing sedation or psychosis, how much is that impacting? So trying to understand, trying to tear apart what will be a primary symptoms of the effect of clozapine on primary symptoms, or of motivation, for instance, or secondary factors. And we have found this is still a work in progress, but there is some statistical evidence that there is a clozapine effect directly on motivation, improving motivation, but also that needs to be balanced by the impairment in motivation associated with the sedation and with the other factors. So perhaps that would be an interesting way to assess properly how the medication is working, or any intervention indeed. And that's what once we finish this study about sedation, perhaps is what I would like to do, using the richness of the clozapine database, all the assessment that we have done over the last few years, how to perhaps start to assess how antipsychotics or antidepressants have a different pathways to impact motivation or emotion through the level of alcohol, the psychosis, or as many as factors as we can find. I'm finishing soon. What we are doing as well is trying to follow up with the previous study about the CHAPAs, about the lack of interest on higher rewards. Why is this happening? And that's led by a super talented ACF, Noam Wolpe, and recently 2 junior colleagues have also joined the study in order to help us with the assessment, and also I think as a learning experience for them to learn new studies or new tools to assess the negative symptoms or the symptoms in general. Whereas the first assessment was using this, the first study with CHAPAs was using this one task. With Noam, we try to do a far bigger. Instead of assessing just one task, let's do 4 different tasks that can help us to understand the different components, the construction of the apathy in the people with schizophrenia, from the option generation to the reward to the outcome anticipation, or the action urge, which is perhaps a way to measure how much information is needed before making a decision. We have recruited 19 so far. Hopefully we will recruit more. But I'm always interested not only on understanding what are the results of these tasks, because we cannot even anticipate that will be not that good compared to healthy volunteers. But can we understand what is the influence of each of the secondary factors in each of these symptoms? The idea, at least in my head, is that perhaps if we can assess what are the different components of the negative symptom or the apathy, and we can also assess what are the secondary sources of the negative symptoms, perhaps we can target far better interventions, even to treat the secondary sources of these negative symptoms or the apathy. Let's see. For that, of course, we need a lot of patients, a lot of volunteers. We need a lot of people helping us, because with 19, we will not be reaching that. And hopefully we will reach at least 100, because otherwise the statistics will be impossible. Finishing the pathophysiology, I think that we need to learn more from a transdiagnostic perspective and how can we communicate with the other colleagues. But we need always to keep in mind that people with schizophrenia might suffer far more from secondary sources of the negative symptoms compared to other the mental health disorders. How can you refer to us? And that's a bit of promotion. We have just started a psychosis center, as Professor Jones was mentioning. It's a regional second opinion unit in order to help people to offer advice about medication, different interventions about how can we improve the persistent positive symptoms and negative symptoms. We do, if necessary, some Botox injection for the hypersalivation or the obsessiveness, or many other things that we do there. 5 minutes ago, we have the first, or 1 hour ago now, the first referral from Sheffield to do an assessment. So let's see how it works. And also acts as a hub for the recruitment for research project, because we are very active both in research clinical trials or in pathophysiology studies. There is the Noham study, but there is also Thea's study about Atlantis and how can we add some sodium valproate in order to treat people who are not eligible for clozapine. How can we, whether that's a useful strategy or not for positive symptoms. I'm finishing. Perhaps, in my opinion, negative symptoms, the terminology for me is obsolete, and perhaps we need to start to remove this terminology from our clinical practice or from our research for sure. Motivational versus apathy and emotional dysfunction. I think that's what we should be starting to use more regularly in clinical practice, at least. Until we have anything better, the use of scales like the BNSS or the canes, that seems to be the way forward to measure negative symptoms in order to communicate between all the specialists in schizophrenia. But we need some common diagnostic terminology and scales. We should not be forgetting what is the distinction between the primary and the secondary negative symptoms in clinical practice, because that might change how we tackle these, or what the sort of interventions that we can do. And please, please, please do refer anyone to the Cambridge Psychosis Centre for second opinions, for research projects, or for anything that you would like to. This should be the last slide here. Thanking a huge amount of people, as you can see, that are involved in different projects, from all the European collaborators and helper in the cases projects, to more the UK base with a chance, with Noham, Paul, Masood, and James and Bagia. All the Americans mostly working for the BNSS validation and psychometrics, and for all the people involved in the clinical aspects and the research at the Cambridge Psychosis Centre, with Chris Jenkins, with Ed Bulmore, Peter Jones, and in parallel with Shankwan and Rudolf. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Emilio. That was absolutely terrific. And congratulations on not just being part of, but leading so much research, not just locally, but in Cambridge.